Here we see the results of the First World War. The youth of all the Christian nations dead and maimed. The Christian nations in huge debt to the Jewish bankers. The monarchies of Germany, Austria and Russia were destroyed, and Lord Balfour Agreement gives Palestine to the Jews. Here we see Rosa Luxemburg, the Jewess. By means of this world revolution, the power of Jewry will be established over all nations of the world. Here we see Bela Kun, the leader of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Jew Bela Kun brings revolution to Hungary. In the spring of 1919, Bela Kun usurped power in Hungary. Bela Kun's dictatorship lasted only 3 months, but during that time, tens of thousands of Christians, they were Roman Catholics, were ruthlessly murdered. The New International Yearbook of 1919 says in part, the government of Bela Kun was composed almost exclusively of Jews.
Politicians, major industrialists, and the military, unable to reach a compromise with the Tsar, gravitated to the idea of a conspiracy. Many of them, political adversaries in the open, were allied behind the scenes, all members of a secret Freemason brotherhood, the Great East of Peoples of Russia. Founded in St. Petersburg about 1912, the organization was controlled by a Supreme Council and had more than 300 members.
By the late fall of 1917, Lenin and his Bolsheviks were poised to seize power. The location is genuine enough, but the film's depiction of the famous storming is remembered differently by some. The provisional government was destroyed, but the damage to the palace consisted of chipped paintwork and a broken window. Kerensky managed to flee Petrograd, never to return.
Alexander Kerensky became head of the Supreme Council. He and other Great East members nurtured a plan of an anti-Tsarist coup.
The Bolsheviks were now the rulers of Russia. But it split the country. In the south, an anti-Bolshevik white army came into being. It was immediately countered by a Bolshevik red army. A civil war was brewing, in which the Bolsheviks' main weapon was coercion, the Red Terror. In Tobolsk, Nicholas eventually heard of the disintegration of his Russia. Nobody knows for sure whether the family realized their fate. Enter Yakov Yurovsky, the Romanovs' new warden. At 1:30 a.m. on July 17th, the family was woken up by Yurovsky and told to prepare to move once again. They were led into a small basement room. There, the 11 prisoners, the family and a small retinue, were suddenly confronted by 11 armed men. There had only been time for incoherent exclamations. Both Yurovsky and one of the guards, Medvedev, recorded in legal depositions their versions of what had happened.
Pavel Medvedev. All the members of the Tsar's family were lying on the floor, very severely wounded. The blood was running in streams.
Yakov Yurovsky. I myself killed Nicholas point blank. Alexandra Fyodorovna died immediately. Alexei and 3 of his sisters were still alive. We had to finish them off. We tried to bayonet one of the girls, but the bayonet would not penetrate her corsage. We undressed the girl and found a corset, torn in places by bullets.
Pavel Medvedev. The heir to the throne was still alive and mourning a little. Yurovsky fired 2 or 3 times at him. Then the air was still.
This telegram to the bosses in Moscow announced in a prearranged code that the whole family was dead. And the Tsar's family was not alone. Every Romanov the Bolsheviks could find, they murdered. Nicholas's brother Michael, 9 uncles and cousins, and Alexandra's sister Ella, 18 Romanovs in all. For years it was debated what part, if any, Lenin had played in ordering the execution of Nicholas and his family. The local Bolsheviks appeared to have carried out the murders on their own initiative, but it now seems clear that it was on orders from Lenin.
I often wondered why Hitler was anti-Semitic. I always asked questions at school and never got a satisfactory answer. But there was a reason why Hitler was anti-Semitic, because he knew what the international Jewish bankers were doing. He knew that they were causing the revolution in Russia and in Germany and all the other European nations. And here the Catholic priests saw Hitler as God's providence. God's holy providence has provided that in a decisive hour he, Hitler, be entrusted with the leadership of the German people. Now we see Germany's troops are now armed to fight against Bolshevism and the Jewish money power. Catholic paper claims Hitler would save humanity from the Jews. The Nazi movement for freeing the world from the Jews is a movement for the renaissance of human dignity. The all-wise and almighty God is behind this movement. Father Franjo Prelic in Zagreb, the Catholic newspaper, 1941. So there was a reaction where the church saw the obvious evils of Freemasonry, the Jewish money power, and Communism and Bolshevism, and they united. Hitler was a Catholic, and here we see him meeting one of the heads of the Catholic Church.
Entire conspiracy, as Hitler knew, is Jewish in origin. That's where it comes from. And that's why Hitler is the most demonized person in history, because when you go up against the greatest liars in history and you lose, you're going to become the most lied about man in history.
Providence has ordained that I should be the greatest liberator of humanity. I am freeing man from a false vision called conscience and morality. The Ten Commandments have lost their validity. Conscience is a Jewish invention. It is a blemish. The heaviest blow which struck humanity was Christianity. Bolshevism is Christianity's illegitimate child. Both are the inventions of the Jew. The struggle for world domination is between me and the Jews. All else is meaningless.
Because when you go up against the greatest liars in history and you lose, you're going to become the most lied about man in history.
After the war, the Allies continued to blockade Germany, and the returning troops who marched through Munich, the capital of Bavaria, were shocked to discover how much their families were still suffering. Millions of Germans were hungry, and thousands more were dying of tuberculosis and influenza. Politics were polarized. Conservatives and socialists each became radical in the face of crisis. With the whole of Germany in turmoil in the spring of 1919, the unrest in Munich resulted in a left-wing takeover of the city, the Räterepublik. This culminated in April 1919 in the Munich Soviet Republic, an attempt to create a Soviet-style government of the city only 18 months after the victory of the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. Government troops were sent in to quash the rebellion, and there was open fighting on the streets of Munich. More than 500 people were killed. The soldiers were supported by the Freikorps, right-wing mercenaries paid for by the government. In Munich, there were cases where the Freikorps simply shot members of the Räterepublik out of hand. Other Freikorps members, like Fridolin von Spahn, heartily approved of the brutal measures which were being used to suppress the communist revolutionaries throughout Germany.
Es klingt vielleicht sehr roh, aber ich konnte ihnen keine Tränen nachweinen. Das war der gerechte Lohn. Sie wollten Deutschland ins Chaos stürzen. Und ich zog daraus den Schluss, man muss das bekämpfen. Und das habe ich dann getan, so gut ich konnte.
Eugene Levinet's father was the communist leader of the Räterepublik. He was executed in June 1919.
I understand from my mother that he had been very brave the way he met his death. And in fact, he called out, "Long live the world revolution."
Eugene Levinet's father was Jewish. And the anti-Semitic prejudice of those on the right was further fueled by the fact that of the leadership of the Räterepublik, most were Jewish.
Sodass natürlich in Deutschland allmählich der Eindruck entstand, ja, Bolschewismus und Judentum ist dasselbe, so ungefähr. Dass sich allgemein eine anti-jüdische Stimmung verbreitet hat, das finde ich sehr natürlich.
перегородка, которая разделяет российскую революцию от европейской. Спасибо, товарищ. Ну да. А значит, товарищ, сначала Польша, потом Германия, Италия. Весь мир! Aviacji! Miłoj! Jewający!
Dr. Adam Weishaupt was born on February 6, 1748, in Ingolstadt, in a city in Bayern, or Bavaria, Germany. This interesting character was the son of a rabbi and converted to Catholicism after his father's death. World-famous central banker, Mayor Amschel Rothschild of the Rothschild dynasty, chose Weishaupt to create the Coven of Golden Dawn, which to this day is Rothschild's private coven. Rothschild instructed Weishaupt to create the ancient illuminated seers of Bavaria. This is better known as the Order of the Illuminati. The name in Luciferian teachings means the bearer of the light, the illuminated, or the enlightened one. In Nesta Webster's book, The World Revolution, she states, "The art of illuminism lay in enlisting dupes as well as adepts, and by encouraging dreams of honest visionaries or the schemes of fanatics, by flattering the vanity of ambitious egotists, by working on unbalanced brains, or by playing such passions as greed and power to make men of totally divergent aims serve the secret purpose of the sect. People with money were welcomed but kept oblivious to actual secrets. The purpose is to win power and riches, to undermine secular or religious government, and obtain the masters of the world." Baron Franz Friedrich Knigge was recruited. He was the most instrumental person in the marriage of the Masons and the Illuminati. This allowed the Illuminati to expand rapidly with the use of Masonic lodges. On August 29, 1781, Congress of Wilhelmsbad declared the alliance official.
the result of the French Revolution. 1/3 of the land was owned by the Catholic Church. It was confiscated and sold to the people for gold. 7,000 Roman Catholic priests were killed. The back of the Catholic Church was broken. The monarchy of France was destroyed. The Jews were emancipated in France and most of Europe. Much of France's intelligentsia were murdered, and more secret societies set up around Europe.
This photograph was locked up in the archives for 70 years. The Russian people were being told that Lenin was on holiday when it was taken. Monday the 21st of January 1924, the leader of the workers' revolution lay dying in the bourgeois surroundings of a millionaire's mansion.
He moaned quietly. Death settled on his face.
The Jewish banker Jacob Schrift gets the Russian gold. Mr. Bakhmetev, the late Russian imperial ambassador to the United States, tells us that the Bolsheviks, after victory, transferred 600 million rubles in gold between the years 1918 and 1922 to the Kunlob and Company Bank, that's Schiff's firm in New York. Stalin himself for a long time was regarded as a Georgian, but it has been revealed that he belonged to the Jewish race. Durgachevili, which is his name, son of Dao, and Dao is a small island in Persia where many banished Portuguese Marano Jews migrated, who later settled in Georgia, Russia.
Why is it to this day that most people have not heard of the Holodomor? The Holodomor was one of the largest genocides of the 20th century.
The Ukrainian peasants didn't want to have anything to do with collectivization and fought it. And they fought it much harder than anyone else did. And there were outright battles. I mean, we're talking hundreds of uprisings in 1920, 1930.
Stalin's trusted envoy, Pavel Postashev, is given sweeping dictatorial powers and sent into Ukraine with an army of secret police to purge the Ukrainian party ranks and to squeeze out the last kernels of grain. 112,000 trusted party members from Russia are now stationed in Ukraine. They guard the standing crops and livestock from the starving, brutally enforcing the law to protect state property.
Teams of people came into Ukraine and went village by village and removed the food from people's houses. Apples, beets, they would lead away the cows, they would take away whatever was in storage. They passed passport laws that forbade Ukrainians peasantry to go into the cities, and eventually they blocked the entire republic, so people couldn't leave.
Stalin crushed the possibilities of Ukrainian autonomy, Ukrainian self-determination in some ways within the Soviet Union through the actions taken in Holodomor. This was an attack across the board against Ukrainian nationality.
At the height of the famine, in June 1933, people in Ukraine were dying at the rate of 28,000 per day.
If any man, woman, or child goes out into the field at night in the summer and picks a single ear of wheat, then the punishment according to law is death by shooting, the communists explained to me.
Jones described what was known as the Law of the 5 Ears of Wheat, signed by Mikhail Kalinin, head of the USSR Central Executive Committee, and Vyacheslav Molotov, head of the Council of People's Commissars. Used judicial repressions of the highest degree as measures of social protection against theft of collective farm property, execution by shooting, and confiscation of all property.
Although there is journalistic writing on this period on it, there were also voices who wished to contradict that testimony. Of course, Walter Duranty is the major case of a liar on these events.
In the early 1930s, Americans received much of their news about life in the Soviet Union from Walter Duranty, the New York Times man in Moscow. Duranty's articles filled the front pages with gripping stories from Mother Russia. During that period, Joseph Stalin was consolidating power over the captive nations that formed the Soviet Union. One step in that drive called for the forced relocation of millions of Ukrainians. Observing these events on the scene was British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. He witnessed the loading of thousands of Ukrainians into boxcars. They were being deported to barren regions of the Soviet Union.
He was not only the greatest liar among the journalists in Moscow, but he was the greatest liar of any journalist that I ever met. And when it came to the famine, the great famine in the Ukraine, brought about by collectivization, that was when his reporting was particularly disgraceful, because he denied that there was any famine.
The Soviets actually grant Duranty permission to tour Ukraine unchaperoned. He reports in the Times that all talk of famine now is ridiculous. Yet documents from the British Foreign Office reveal that in private conversations at the British Embassy, Duranty said as many as 10 million people had died.
When they were discussing the question of recognizing the Soviet Union, the United States government recognizing the Soviet Union, the articles of Duranty were considered as very valuable evidence on the side of recognition. But it didn't worry the New York Times, who featured his reports.
The following year, the Soviet cover-up achieves its ultimate success, a seat in the League of Nations. And this in spite of the fact Western governments knew all about the famine.
The government of Weimar, the democratic government, was well aware of what was going on in the Soviet Union. But the attitude of the government was, I would say, you could call it passive.
Another Times correspondent, Herbert Matthews, also covered for collectivism. During the so-called Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, communists throughout Spain brutally massacred more than 6,000 priests, friars, and nuns. Matthews' dispatches, however, depicted the communists as idealistic Democrats seeking to liberate Spain from tyranny. No mention was made of the communist atrocities. The establishment media's backing of Matthews and Durante points to the existence of a larger policy to legitimize communism.
Communism is the most absolute form of government. So you actually have in the communist system a rule by an oligarchic few, a rule by an elite. That is precisely what the Council on Foreign Relations insiders have been pushing for in this country and throughout the world throughout the past century. So there is a natural confluence of interest there, not an antagonism between the communists and internationalists here in our government. They are both after the same thing.
Stalin ends the famine with a single decree. Having broken the Ukrainian farmers, he can afford to give out grain on the collectives during the harvest in 1933. 1934. Purges take place in the cities and mark the end of Ukrainian participation in the running of their country. As the terror intensifies, the jail cells are rapidly emptied as Ukrainian nationalism becomes an offense punishable by death. The Nazis invite an international commission to inspect the mass graves left from Soviet rule. In the town of Vinnytsia alone, the commission uncovers the bodies of over 9,000 workers, poets, priests. No one can estimate the full total of those who disappeared in Stalin's reign of terror. Ukraine's only crime was that she never adapted to wearing chains.
in many of the places where the famine was most devastating, Russians were brought in to replace Ukrainian villagers. In other words, the nature of the country changed after the famine.
What happens in Ukraine, it wouldn't be wrong to see it as a kind of colonization. It was a horrible blow to Ukrainian national identity, social solidarity, political trust.
I'm not going to do what I usually do and really pick on the Masons tonight. I'm just simply going to read from two books of theirs, and I'm going to let the Masons draw their own conclusion. That which we must say to the crowd is, we worship a God, but it is a God that one adores without superstition. To you, sovereigns, grand inspectors general, we say this, that you may repeat it to the brethren of the 32nd, 31st, and 30th degree. The Masonic religion should be, by all of us initiates of the high degree, maintained in the purity of the Luciferian doctrine. If Lucifer were not God, would Abaddon, now before I go on, I want to say Abaddon is found in Revelations for you students of Revelation as the keeper of the pit, the demon over all the rest of the demons. Would Abaddon, the God of the Christians, whose deeds prove his cruelty, profanity, and hatred of men, barbarism, and repulsion for science, would Abaddon and his priests culminate him? Yes, Lucifer is God. Thus, the doctrine of Satanism is a heresy, and the true and pure philosophical religion is the belief in Lucifer, the equal of Abaddon, Jesus Christ. But Lucifer, God of light and God of good, is struggling for humanity against Abaddon, the God of darkness and evil. They're calling Jesus Abaddon. They're calling Lucifer everything we believe of Jesus, and Jesus everything we believe of the devil. And that's in one of their own books.
Who, what, how is Leviathan?
Well, Leviathan is this amazing sea serpent, and it's the greatest creature that God ever created, right alongside to Behemoth. The book of Job talks about Leviathan and Behemoth, and the descriptions are really awesome. Basically, what this is a dragon that lived in the sea. This thing lived in the deep, and it was a terror anytime that it came up and got around men. However, it's more than just that, because the scriptures use Leviathan a few times to describe something else, and that something else is this angelic entity that is high above everything else. So at the end of this description of this earthly creature, and it makes it very clear that it is an earthly creature in the book of Job, it says, he sees everything that is on high. He is the foremost among the sons of pride. And so it really throws you for a loop when you're reading that description, because you think you're reading about this animal, and then all of a sudden you're reading something that sounds like it's about Satan. Because the sons of pride, or the sons of rebellion, are the fallen angels. So we know immediately from that there's something interesting going on with this creature. And then we go to Isaiah 27:1, which is an eschatological verse talking about what's happening in the end times. And that verse says that in the day of the Lord, with his great and strong sword, God is going to punish that serpent, that crooked Leviathan, and he's going to slay that dragon that is in the sea. So he's using an earthly creature to talk about a heavenly creature, and I believe that is Satan. Many, many times depicted as a serpent in different scriptures, but also in ancient world. Zeus, king of the gods in Greco-Roman pantheon, depicted as a serpent in many places, many statues throughout the world.
Wow. So how does this relate then to the battle of good and evil? I mean, how does this play out in our world today?
The book of Revelation says that beast comes up out of the abyss in the end times, and he is the last king of the world. So he was the first king of Babylon, and he'll be the last king of Babylon. The religions, I call them occult religions, but they're mystery religions and they're mystery fraternities throughout history. They know that this king has been put away and that he's going to return. Let me give you an example of that. So the Freemasons, when they initiate someone to become a Master Mason, they talk to him as if the great architect of the universe, or what they call God, is speaking to the Master Mason. And this is what this God says. This is a quote. "Seek ye the grave of Hiram, who has carried my will with him to the tomb. This eternal quest is yours, until you have found your builder. No more shall I speak until ye have found and raised my beloved Son, and you have listened to the words of my messenger, and with him as your guide have finished the temple which I shall then inhabit. Amen." End quote. They understand that there is this very important character that has gone to the grave. He has gone to Sheol, just like Ezekiel 31 tells us. But that they need to bring him back. And this is not just the Freemasons. It goes to all the secret societies. They try to get there in different ways, but they're all sort of aiming for the same goal. So they have two goals. One, to bring us to a utopia, at least a utopia for the elites. And then number two, to bring back the world dictator who is supposedly enlightened. You know, Satan's not going into this thing without a plan. He's the first creature ever created, you know, the first thing that Yeshua ever made before even the rest of the universe and the rest of the angels. So we can't underestimate how absolutely capable he is in terms of strategy. In the book, I talk a lot about the occult and the mystery religions and the mystery schools throughout history and what their agenda is and what they have been doing, mostly behind the scenes, to affect human history and to blind us all to what's going on. The scripture actually names him as Asher, and it blew my mind when I realized that, in fact, the Bible is talking about Asher, and it's the name of the Antichrist. So let me talk a little bit about who he was, and I think he was actually Nimrod, and he goes into Egypt and becomes the first king of Egypt and unites that land. There were many tribes there at that time, and he brings them all together. Interestingly, the name Osiris is actually the same as Asher, because in the Egyptian, it's Asur. Only the Greeks changed it to Osiris. And there's a very interesting passage in the pyramid texts, which talk a lot about Osiris and Isis. But this one particular text says that the Egyptians, when Osiris died, when he was killed, that they preserved his efflux, bodily fluid. That could be blood, could be semen. I think it's the latter, because that contains the complete genome. Do you remember a few years ago when Egyptologists said that they found the tomb of Osiris?
Yes.
Yeah, so they got down there and they found this casket, but it was empty. How do we know whether or not it was really empty, or whether they got down there, understood what they had found, and emptied it out before they brought the cameras down? I don't know if somebody has already found this, but if and when they do, that opens the gate. There is going to be a dark resurrection, and most Christians have no idea. So what I try to show is that this person has already lived Satan has already used him. He was already the greatest king of Babylon, the greatest king that ever lived. And he will be returning again in the end times. So we're completely unprepared for this dark resurrection to happen, which is why the whole world, Revelation says, will wonder after this beast.
How will we be able to tell? I mean, is it going to be born as an infant and then we have to wait 30 years because he's going to be a false Messiah?
You know, everything Satan does is a mimicry of things that God has done. And so I would suspect that he will bring his Messiah, his false Messiah, into the world as a baby and have him grow up. Because I think he's going to try and fulfill or pretend like he's the fulfillment of a lot of the prophecies in the scriptures about the Messiah, that his reconstructed genetic material might be placed in a virgin, might have already been placed in a virgin, and that it is undergoing that process of growing right now, and then we'll have to wait for a while to see whether or not he shows up. And the Jewish people, we're clearly told in Scripture, are going to be fooled by this. They're going to think that this guy is the Messiah, and they're going to enter into a covenant with him. And then later on will be sorely displeased when he breaks that covenant and tramples them down, takes them away as slaves, and only then will the true Messiah show back up and all of Israel will repent. Let me just say, the occult has been aware of this and planning on bringing him back for thousands of years. And so I dedicate chapters in the book to showing that that is the case, and they know it, and they're looking forward to that day that he can be brought back.
This is a long exploration, frankly. It's going to take some time to elaborate, but there are, basically the Eyes Wide Shut sex parties are real. These things take place. They do have these crystal skull type of things that they, like in the Indiana Jones film, they have the crystal skull. They have these type of skulls they set up at the parties, and they feed the energy into those skulls.
Of your tricks. I'm tired of your deceit. I am so tired of you liberal church in America. I'm tired of your witchcraft. This is not an accident. We've swallowed this now for 30 years. And now you depict Jesus as a woman. I'm not going to accept that. I'm a Roman Catholic. I believe in God as Father, creator of heaven and earth. I believe that Jesus is his son, his only son. I believe that he died and he suffered and he rose. Your catechisms are so watered down, they say nothing except love your neighbor. No, you gotta love God first. You gotta live with God in your heart. You can't give what you don't possess. I don't like your church. You have nothing to offer. You do nothing but destroy. And so you plant this mime, a woman as Jesus. You dare do that. We're not going to go for all those crazy things that you're pushing out as new and cultural and American. They're not American. America was built on God. America was built on trust in God. And you've made it pagan because you have no spirituality that attracts. Your whole purpose is to destroy. I am proud to be a Roman Catholic. And I will say mankind instead of humankind. You've been strong too long. I, for one, have a right to be a Roman Catholic without your persecution. And you dare to depict Jesus as a woman. Try it with Martin Luther King. Put a white woman in his place and see what happens. Try it with Moses or Muhammad. No, we're the only ones that can be bashed to the ground and we say nothing. My community and I proclaim to you and to this nation, we are Roman Catholic. We have hidden under bushels too long. We have taken everything, and we have been obedient to what? To a destructive force.
The Jewish bankers were financing the Spanish Revolution. During these revolutions, the Catholic Church was always on the receiving end. And then we see the priests, the Catholic priests, fighting revolutionaries in the Spanish Revolution.
It began as any good dream should, with bursts of joy and optimism. When King Alfonso XIII decided to allow elections, socialist and liberal republicans, anarchists and communists swept to overwhelming victories, and the Second Spanish Republic was born. But the flame of hope flickered out in just 2 years amid the poverty and unemployment of the Great Depression. Conservatives won the next election and rolled back many of the changes. The left, incensed, countered with a general strike, but it was shut down by the army. In 1936, power swung back to the left, when the Popular Front, a broad coalition of liberal and socialist groups, eked out a parliamentary majority. The political divide quickly became a chasm. The right, consisting of the military, conservatives, and the Catholic Church, feared for the very survival of Spain. President Manuel Azaña further inflamed the situation as he began reinstituting changes from 1931. that hindered large farms and the church. At the same time, anarchists began pushing Bolshevism, and some conservatives joined the fascist Falange Española. Multiple militias formed on both sides. It was a battleground for idealists. Violence escalated, culminating in a series of assassinations that finally killed democracy. The Civil War exploded with a coup led by General Franco and the army.
Fighting in Spanish Morocco in the early part of the century, Franco had made a name for himself as an energetic and courageous officer. And he was soon given command of the Spanish Foreign Legion, going on to become, at 33, Spain's youngest general. In 1931, to avoid civil war, King Alfonso went into exile. Each side became determined not merely to defeat the other, but to exterminate it. Churches were burned, priests murdered, workers, liberals, leftists were shot down.
The social upheavals of the Republic had led to a progressive breakdown of law and order. In the countryside, peasants hungry to own the land they worked seized it. Some landowners had been killed, and others feared for their lives.
Peace was impossible, so we had to head for the hills. If it's just not possible to live, then you have to find a different solution, which was the rising against the Republic.
In 1936, Hitler had been in power for 3 years. Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922. In Russia, Stalin had begun the show trials and purges of his enemies. Immediately, both sides sought and found gestures of support from rival sponsors abroad. In the liberal democratic world, individual sympathy for the plight of the Spanish Republic was widespread, but practical help from governments was to prove a different matter. The army rebels' pleas, on the other hand, were soon answered. Two days after the Spanish uprising, Franco had appealed to the Führer for help. Hitler decided to send not the few anti-aircraft guns and fighters that Franco had asked for, but a full squadron of Junkers transport planes to airlift the Spanish Army of Africa from Morocco. 1,500 of these troops were transported to Seville to begin their fighting passage to Madrid. These crack troops of the Spanish army were to play a decisive role in the war. His help was later rewarded with a constant supply of Spanish iron ore.
The nationalists grew stronger. Mussolini added 100,000 men and more firepower. The undermanned Republic, without most of the army, had to arm its citizens and turn to the communists of the Soviet Union for help. Support also came from Mexico and from an unexpected source. More than 40,000 volunteers from 53 nations joined the Republicans, including a group from distant America known as the Lincoln Battalion.
"70 years ago, 500 young Scots risked their lives by volunteering to fight in another country's war. This group of men threw themselves headfirst into the bloody struggle against fascism. A third never returned. They were the Scots who fought Franco. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 was a conflict that gripped Scotland. It was the defining moment for a generation of Scots and, for a time, the country's greatest cause. Proportionately, Scots made a greater contribution than any other nationality. 549 of those volunteers came from Scotland. It was also illegal. At the start of the war, the British government signed up to a non-intervention agreement, outlawing participation in Spain's war and banning the sale of arms to the country. The Scotland those men left behind was far removed from the Scotland of today. It was a time of regular strike action, incendiary street preachers, and a belief in great causes. Scotland stood out in Europe as both one of its poorest countries and one of its most radical. In February 1937, the newly formed British Battalion of the International Brigades had arrived at Jarama and been given the task of stemming a fascist advance on the Spanish capital. Over 100 Scots were involved in wading through the winter mud to wage war. The Battle of Jarama was an almighty slog that set the fault lines for this most bloody of conflicts. The ill-prepared and under-equipped British battalion was left dangerously exposed at Jarama. In the first week of fighting, their entire machine gun company was ambushed and captured by General Franco's Army of Africa, the Moors. Emboldened by the outcome of the battle, the British battalion's leaders planned an offensive at Brunetti, to the west of Madrid. In the baking July heat, optimism soon turned to terror. The British were slaughtered. Of 331 men present on the first day of battle, 289 were killed, wounded or captured. Scots suffered more than most. By the summer of 1937, the Scots who fought Franco were demoralized and had witnessed slaughter on an unimaginable scale. The great cause they had pledged themselves to was ridden with bleak reality. In Spain, their idealism had been severely tested. They had found hell. At the end of August 1938, the Scots who fought Franco were holding firm in Catalonian mountains. They remained deeply committed to the cause, despite monstrous conditions and heavy losses. Yet their fate was set not in battle, but in the corridors of power. In late September, the Republican government announced the withdrawal of the International Brigades. They believed that the move would force Hitler and Mussolini to remove their troops from Spain. It was a forlorn hope. Surviving Scots marched through the streets of Barcelona as part of an emotional farewell parade. The great Republican leader, La Pasionaria, paid tribute to their efforts, telling them, "You can go with pride."
It was an endless, grinding war until Franco tried a new tactic. Living under the constant threat of bombing took its toll, slowly draining away the will of the people and the Republic. In January 1939, Barcelona fell, and Madrid soon followed in March, bringing to a close the Spanish Civil War.
Valle de los Caídos, in Spain, the Valley of the Fallen. Nearly half a century after the Civil War, the men who created and won that war have preserved its massive monument. General Franco called the uprising against the Republican government a crusade, a fight for Christian civilization. It was for nearly 3 years the world's moral arena. Inside this mausoleum today, there is no hint of reconciliation. This huge tomb for Franco's men was hewn in a granite mountain by his defeated enemies, Republican prisoners of war. Behind the altar, the Generalissimo himself, Franco. As a soldier, Franco had served the Republic. He was called a fascist and died a dictator.
Mexican government, during the persecution, any religious act was condemned by the law.
If they didn't fight in that time, we wouldn't have the churches open.
We forget what our grandparents did for our faith. They were risking everything just to go to Mass. They were risking their lives.
They were normal people, and they were called to participate in the defense of their faith, and they willingly said yes to that call.
Part of the greater tragedy of the Cristero movement is that this period in Mexican history has been basically wiped away from the history books.
Mexico in 1926 is reeling from more than a decade of war and violence. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 has failed to create lasting peace. President Plutarco Elias Calles seeks to centralize all power in the hands of the federal government. He views the Catholic Church as an obstacle to his plan. Mexico's 1917 Constitution imposes many restrictions on the Catholic Church. However, these controversial articles are not enforced until President Calles comes to power. Overnight, public worship is forbidden. The government seizes churches and monasteries and exiles foreign priests. Mexican clergy are banned from wearing clerical garb in public and threatened with jail if they criticize the Calles government.
The Mexican government was violently anti-clerical. Not just closing churches, but shooting, hanging, murdering priests.
They were losing their way of life, and at the end, they were forbidden to worship. So they came to a conclusion that they had to resist for dignity. People fought in self-defense, but it was the army against people with stones and bricks and nothing. Many people in the clashes decided that there was no solution but the war.
For the next 3 years, Mexican Catholics wage a guerrilla war against insurmountable odds. They become known as Cristeros, named after their battle cry, Viva Cristo Rey, or Long Live Christ the King. When the Cristero revolt begins, few take the rebellion seriously. Least of all, President Calles. He writes to the French ambassador saying that without Mass and the sacraments, Mexican Catholics will soon forget their faith, and the conflict would be over within a year.
He really believed that. No more Catholic Church, no more fanaticism of the masses, of the Indian masses. And with his hostility, he couldn't understand the strong religious feeling of the Mexican people. So that young man lost all hope, all possibility for a brilliant military career. He was working for cosmetics. And I found a letter of him who is a general of the Mexican army, making perfume for the lady. What a shame, what a shame.
Leaders of the National League for the Defense of Religious Freedom asked General Gorostieta to transform the disorganized Cristero fighters into a modern army.
Okay, let's make an army. Let's make a formidable army out of a group of ragtag peasants and huaraches, out of a few game ranchers, out of some tender-footed clergy who are trembling at the thought of holding a weapon for the first time. You want me to make a National Guard out of that? Look at me. Do you have proper weapons? No. You have an ammunition supply? No. You have a central command? No. How many is that? 3 no's. All you have is belief. But belief will not save them in battle.
Despite their limited means, the Cristeros rally around Gorostieta's leadership and grow in numbers and in strength. Their wives and daughters smuggle weapons and ammunition to the front lines.
The only ammunition they got, outside from that they take in the battlefield, it was a work of woman. Without a woman, you don't understand the Cristiada. Without a woman, you have no Cristiada. The Cristiada, at its best moment, counted more than 40,000 rifles, 50,000 in small bands all over the country, and 25,000 in the center-west of the country. Under the supreme leadership of Gorostieta, the Cristero are climbing.
Today we are going to send a message. We are going to send a message to Calles and to the rest of the world that freedom is not just for writers and for politicians and for fancy documents. Freedom is our home, our wives, our children, our faith. Freedom is our lives. And we will defend it or die trying. It is not only our duty to defend it, but it is our right. You must remember that men will fire bullets, but God decides where they land. ¡Que viva Cristo Rey! ¡Que viva Cristo Rey! ¡Que viva Cristo Rey!
They say that he was there for the money, or he was there for power because he wanted to become a president. When my grandmother died, she left letters that my grandfather wrote to her. My mother showed them to me. In the letters, you can see that he really believed in freedom for the faith.
He discovered the real Christianity in the face of the Mexican people and in the face of his soldiers.
The Knights of Columbus began activities in Mexico in 1905. By the 1920s, the Knights were very active throughout the country. And as the Calles government began to crack down on the Catholic Church, we were also victims and martyrs. Many of our members lost their lives. 2/3 of our councils were shut down by the government. 6 members who were priests have been canonized as martyrs.
In the United States, the Knights of Columbus reacted to the situation, immediately passing a resolution at the Supreme Convention condemning what Calles is doing in Mexico. The Knights had also begun raising $1 million for the purposes of educating the American public about the situation with the persecution.
But the Knights' efforts also raised the specter of anti-Catholicism in the United States. Supporters of President Calles include the powerful KKK.
This caused a lot of criticism of the Knights. This is the 1920s. The 1920s is when the Ku Klux Klan was at its peak in America.
I found in the archives of President Calles telegrams of the Klan, and they say to President Calles, the Knights of Columbus are raising a fund of $1 million for the Mexican Catholic Church. If you need it, we'll raise a fund of $10 million for helping you in your valiant fight.
All this, after 3 years, helped to bring the government to settle things. So they agreed to sign what is known the Los Arreglos in 1929.
The 1929 peace agreement opens the churches and restores religious freedom for Mexican Catholics. But the Constitution remains unchanged, allowing future governments to once again turn the law against the faith. For the Cristeros, the treaty was a death sentence. Fearful of a resurgence, 500 Cristero leaders are rounded up and executed. 5,000 others are purged in what becomes the Cristeros' final sacrifice for religious freedom.
History has approached the Cristero revolt with silence.
I think the example of the men and women that participated in that movement is a great example for us. It's a great lesson for us to learn of how important religious freedom is in our time.
For me, it's more than only something that happened 80 years ago. I think this is something that really is the foundation not only of Mexico, but I think also of the whole continent. I don't know what would have happened if these brave people wouldn't have stood up for their beliefs.
Do you regard black magic as being purely fictitious, or is there some truth in it?
Some truth. 100% truth. There is nothing fictitious about black magic, in any way whatever. It is a fact. It is a fact which has existed for several thousand years. I mean, when we talk about black magic, we are talking about Satanism, necromancy, alchemy, witchcraft, the worship of Satan, the worship of dark forces, whether it's voodoo, whether it's something practiced in the Western world or the Eastern world, whether it's easily defined or not easily defined, the order of the left-hand path. It is basically the worship of the force of evil,
When the Mason learns that the key to the warrior on the block is the proper application of the dynamo of living power, he has learned the mystery of his craft. The seething energies of Lucifer are in his hands. Is there any direct evidence from Masonic literature that they would provide information or instruction to conjure Satan or his demons? This book is The Builders. It was written by Joseph Fort Newton in 1914. It's the classic which today is often presented to newly raised Master Masons. The bibliography contains references to most of the major books and authors which reveal the hidden meanings behind Masonry. This is page 57. It's a page in the chapter on the secret doctrine. It says, "Perhaps the greatest student in this field of esoteric teaching and method, certainly the greatest now living, is Arthur Edward Waite, to whom it is a pleasure to pay tribute." Waite, who until his death in 1945 was considered to be a great student of the secret doctrine, wrote this Masonic encyclopedia, a new encyclopedia of Freemasonry. Waite also wrote the Book of Black Magic. On page 244 through 248 of the Book of Black Magic, we find detailed instructions on how to conjure Lucifer. This book was published by the authority of the Supreme Council of the 33rd Degree. It has a bibliography listing selected references in the back. It's known as a Bridge to Light. Here's the title page. And we can see down at the bottom that it was, in fact, written with the authorization of the Supreme Council. Here's the selected references, which are found on page 329 of A Bridge to Light. And we notice down at the bottom that they recommend Manly Palmer Hall's 1928 Secret Teachings of All Ages, an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian symbolical philosophy is the other title. This is the full page of the chapter heading on ceremonial magic and sorcery in Hall's book. I'm going to do a close-up of the left-hand top of the page. Hall writes, "Ceremonial magic is the ancient art of invoking and controlling spirits by a scientific application of certain formula." Down below he writes, "While the elaborate ceremonial magic of antiquity was not necessarily evil," well, believe me, what Hall is talking about here is conjuring demons, and it is extremely evil. Modus operandi for the invocation of spirits. This is a rather nice way to say the methods to be used to conjure demons. Here is a drawing from the book showing a magician invoking a demon. Notice that he's standing in a magic circle, and on the upper left-hand corner we've got Baphomet, the goat of Mendez. How would you go about controlling a demon once it was invoked? Well, the Secret Teachings of All Ages provides an example pact, which is found on this page, CIV. It reads, "At last a pact is agreed upon." It may read as follows: "I hereby promise the great spirit Lucifuge, prince of demons, that each year I will bring unto him a human soul to do with as it may please him, and in return Lucifuge promises to bestow upon me the treasures of the earth and fulfill my every desire for the length of my natural life. If I fail to bring to him each year the offering specified above, then my own soul shall be forfeit to him." And it's signed, "The Inficant signs the pact with his own blood." This is the Lost Keys of Freemasonry. On page 57, Hall writes, "The Master Mason, if he be truly a master, is in communication with the unseen powers that move the destinies of life." If he be truly a master, is in communication with the unseen powers that move the destinies of life.
22. Juni morgens setzte nun dieser größte Kampf der Weltgeschichte ein. Seitdem sind etwas über 3,5 Monate vergangen. Und ich darf hier zunächst keine Feststellung treffen. Es ist alles seitdem planmäßig verlaufen. Ich spreche das erst heute aus. Ich spreche das erst heute aus, weil ich es heute aussprechen darf, dass dieser Gegner bereits getroffen ist und die sich erheben werden.
I've said of Freemasonry, it's harmless in my view. The founding of the United States of America was a Masonic experiment, and that was the pinnacle of its achievement. And there's no secret agenda, and there are no secrets. And all these people that accuse Freemasonry of being of having a secret agenda are deluded. I've now had to change my mind and confess I was wrong. And there is an agenda which appears to be immensely powerful. And I think they see it as the fulfillment of the 3,000-year mission from the time of Solomon. Mm. But the really scary bit was when we realized that the Pentagon is Stonehenge rebuilt.
Really?
And the man that designed it was President of the United States of America at the time, and just about to take his country into the Second World War. And they had to build the Pentagon quickly, and they were building it somewhere else, and he said, I want it here. And I want the middle of it here, and I want it looking like this. And he actually gave the design to the architects, and he's built it following the instructions that are in the 32nd and 33rd degree of Freemasonry, which is about defense of the realm. The whole building was structured 25 times the size of Stonehenge, but every corner, every wall follows the patterning. They understood it, exactly what they're doing. Every junction, every monument at intersections, everything about the structure was originally designed to follow to the millimeter using these ancient measurements, megalithic units, megalithic yards and seconds of arc. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a bit of an amateur architect himself, but for him on such an important thing, when the army said there isn't time, we can't move it, and he insisted to be put in a place that was called Hell's Bottom. It was just an absolute horrible place where they had to drain riverbank and move marshes, and it had to be built at some speed because they knew they were going to war. But it had to be in that exact position to have this juxtaposition with this chamber and the centre of the Capitol. And it had to be at that angle, and it had to have the 5 walls, because that's what's dictated in the Scottish Rite, and the walls within the walls, and the sizes of them had to be exactly as they are, because they are the megalithic dimensions that we find in the 6,000-year-old henges across here in Europe. And the chances of all these things being done in 1941 by accident are non-existent. And the words spoken in the 32nd and 33rd degrees describe exactly what happened. They were building this structure to win the war that was going to turn the world into their oyster, because they were building the New Jerusalem, because these people were originally Jewish priesthood. According to the rituals of Freemasonry, they describe how they when the destruction of the temple took place in 70 AD, when Titus and the Roman troops destroyed it and they lost the war, 1.3 million Jews lay dead, priests escaped to Europe, and this is all explained in Masonic ritual, which at one time I would have thought was a fanciful story, but it actually totally fits. And there, as they moved from northern France, they met the Normans, the Norse people, who had come down from Scandinavia, who had got knowledge of the original structures that were built, because they were the builders, and they realized that they needed to work together, and for the last 1,000 years they have been working together.
I mean, the reason we're given why America entered World War II is because on December 7th, later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. they knew what they were doing then.
Yep, there are some funny bits in there. Another awkward one, which almost can't work out and don't like to think about too much. From the center of Washington D.C., exactly 3 megalithic degrees. That's 366 of the Earth's surface. Takes you to the western tower of the Twin Towers. To the millimeter. And you try and link anything else by any means, and nothing else works at all. And of course, it could be a coincidence, but it's a very strange one, especially given the timing. I certainly cannot buy, personally, conspiracy theory that the US military or political people were involved in the thing, but it's very odd.
I guess what I'm alluding to there as well, obviously, is that they were beginning the building on the Pentagon because they knew they were entering the war.
Oh yes,
you know,
yes.
but the reason for them to entering the war didn't come until later.
Sure, my understanding is that the Americans had put the Japanese into a terrible economic, painted them into a corner where.
That's right.
So certainly the powers that be at the highest level probably knew all this. If these people were driving for the war, it's possible that they just foresaw the war coming and that they hadn't set out to cause it per se, or at least not deliberately to cause it. That's what I like to think anyway. That's what I like to think anyway.
To understand where it came from, we have to go back to the 11th century. At that time, the church was sending thousands of men as crusaders to recapture the Holy Land, and in particular Jerusalem, which had fallen into Muslim hands. Now, who were these men, these crusaders? They came from all walks of life. The one thing they had in common was their belief in the Catholic teachings. However, when these men traveled to the Middle East, they were suddenly exposed to many different beliefs and spiritual teachings that they had never heard before. These teachings came from Judaic and Islam mysticism, they came from Egypt, from Greece, and even from faraway places like India. They also began to hear different interpretations of familiar biblical texts, things they had never heard in their church. One particular passage stood out. It was a story of the snake tempting Eve with the apple. The Catholic Church had taught them that the snake was Lucifer or Satan, who deceived Eve by promising that if she would eat from the forbidden tree, she would become like God. Suddenly these men were introduced to a very different interpretation. They heard that Lucifer was not evil or Satan, but the God who wanted to save and educate mankind. In truth, they called him the light bringer, the real God, and that Yahweh or Adonai in the Bible, was in actuality the devil, the suppressor of mankind, because he didn't want Eve and Adam to know their true identity. This teaching became the famous Luciferian doctrine. Now, when these men returned home from the Holy Land, they continued talking about these new ideas and interpretations. But they knew they could only do so under strictest secrecy, as the church would torture and kill anybody who would question or challenge their teachings and authority. This eventually led to the birth of many secret societies, most famously the Templars, the Rosicrucian, and the various Masonic orders. These very mixed teachings from many different occult traditions were secretly studied, eventually wrapped in rituals, and protected by gruesome and blood-curdling oaths that the members had to swear to ensure secrecy. But everything changed in the year 1888, when the founder of the Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky, made most of these teachings public in her famous book, The Secret Doctrine. Central to Madame Blavatsky's teaching was the Luciferian doctrine. The first edition of her book stated that Lucifer is the only god for our planet. Another famous person was Alice Bailey, who founded the Lucifer Publication Company in 1922. And then there was the well-known science fiction writer H.G. Wells, who also published a book called The New World Order in 1940. With this book, he promoted a world government and a secular world religion. But it does come with a hefty price. Anybody who aligns himself with this god of the world to obtain riches, power, fame, and so on, enters a Faustian bargain. Chances are they will become his servant after their physical death. Such energies are never given for free.
To put it carefully, most of these people followed a not very mainstream religion. So you have Catholics, Protestants, all sorts of religions. These people, most of them were Luciferians. And then you can say religion is a fairy tale, God doesn't exist. None of that is real. Well, for these people, it is truth and reality. And they served something immaterial, what they call Lucifer. And I also was in contact with those circles, only I laughed at it because to me they were just clients. So I went to places called churches of Satan. So now we are talking about Satanism? Yes. So I visited these churches just as a visitor, dropped by. And then they were doing their Holy Mass with naked women and liquor and stuff. And it just amused me. I didn't believe in any of this stuff and was far from convinced if any of this was real. It was just a spectacle. Yes, in my opinion, the darkness and evil is within the people themselves. I didn't make the connection yet. So I was a guest in those circles, and it amused me greatly to see all those naked women and the other things. It was the good life. But then at some point I was invited, which is why I'm telling you all this, to participate in sacrifices abroad.
Dat was het breekpunt.
That was the breaking point.
Kinderen.
Children.
Okay.
You were asked to do that?
Ja, ik kon het niet.
Yes, and I couldn't do that. Would you like to stop for a moment, by the way?
Nee.
No.
En toen begon...
And then I started to slowly break down. I lived through quite a lot as a child myself, and this really touched me deeply.
Alles ging op.
Everything changed.
Maar dat is de
But
wereld waar
that is the world I found myself in. And then I started to refuse assignments within my job. I could no longer do it, which made me a threat. For them, of course. I was no longer capable of functioning optimally. My performance started to shake and I had to refuse tasks. I had not participated. The purpose of the whole thing, eventually, in that world, is that they have everybody in their pocket. You need to be susceptible to blackmail. And blackmailing me proved to be very hard if I look back on it. They wanted to do that through those children. And that broke me, is that you are not telling me something new, what they also do in politics. If you Google this, you'll find enough worldwide witness accounts to know this isn't a Walt Disney fairy tale.
Walt Disney verhaaltjes. Het is helaas.
Unfortunately, the truth is that worldwide they have been doing this for thousands of years. I once studied theology, and even in the Bible you find references to these practices with Israelites, including the sacrificing of children. So this is pertinent. All this made me believe, because I realized there was more to life than meets the eye. There is a whole invisible world. It is real. You really do talk about a dark force and a manifestation of light.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
On July 16, 1945, in the Jornado del Muerto desert in New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was detonated. Witnessing this event were members of the Manhattan Project, the Los Alamos director Robert Oppenheimer, test director Kenneth Bainbridge, and many other top-level scientists and military personnel.
One of the world's oldest and largest secret societies seeks to destroy the Catholic Church.
This true story of what happened on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, begins with a top-secret meeting on September 13th, 1942, which took place roughly 75 miles north of San Francisco. The meeting place, known as the Bohemian Grove, is a woodland hideaway owned by the Brotherhood of Death Front called the Bohemian Club. The Bohemian Club serves to provide an exclusive location where multiple Brotherhood of Death secret societies can meet and participate in bizarre occult ceremonies. A key ritual sacrifice, known to participants as the cremation of care, occurs annually in July.
The Bohemian Grove has been the epicenter for many meetings held by high-ranking Brotherhood of Death agents.
Foremost among the attendees of the September 1942 meeting were the members of the S1 Executive Committee, led by an agent of the Brotherhood named Vannevar Bush. Although it would seem that the S1 Committee were the ones responsible for the bombs, there was a much more powerful but unseen group that controlled them. One of the top men in this group was Bernard Baruch. Since the early 1930s, members of the Brotherhood of Death had been meeting at the Bohemian Grove to make their plans to start a Second World War. In control of these men was Baruch. By the early 1940s, with the Second World War now underway, Baruch and other secret society members, loyal to the Brotherhood but performing their daily roles as important political figures, had started to fine-tune their plan for the use of the atomic bomb. Bernard Baruch played a behind-the-scenes role in ensuring agents serving the Brotherhood were in key atomic bomb targeting-related positions. Unknown to most people in the United States and the Western world in general is the fact that in 1945, Nagasaki was the center of Christianity in Japan. With Oppenheimer expressing shock about Nagasaki, Edwin Reischauer, a U.S. Army intelligence expert on Japan serving on Oppenheimer's team, was also falsely credited with having a deciding role in selecting Nagasaki. However, as the handcuffs of secrecy were eventually removed after the war, Reischauer revealed in his autobiography, as did General Leslie M. Groves in his book, that it was Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson who made the decision to destroy Nagasaki. Stimson was initiated into the Skull and Bones Secret Society and graduated from Yale in 1888. In 1945, he was a key leader in the Brotherhood of Death. The Brotherhood of Death leaders understood the marketing principle called the Law of Leadership. This marketing principle states that people remember the first event in a new category and pay less attention to the second event in a new category. Understanding this principle is critical for understanding why Hiroshima, by being first, was actually a diversionary target. William Lawrence would write after Nagasaki was destroyed, quote, "Destiny chose Nagasaki as the ultimate target," end quote. His choice of the word destiny is highly significant because in the Brotherhood of Death religion, destiny is used in literature to communicate among insiders their active role and involvement.
Many Pharisees belong to the Jewish occult group called the Cabal, or the Satanic through and through. We showed how these Pharisees hate Christ so vehemently. Once we understand that the Pharisees of Christ's day was involved in a Satanic secret society, we can understand how they, the Jews, could hate him so much. And a lot of them had their little subcultures under them called the Freemasons of the world. The Freemasons of the world.
Wo denn? Wann hat jemals England vor Frauen und Kindern Halt gemacht? Der ganze Blockadekrieg ist überhaupt nur ein Krieg gegen Frauen und gegen Kinder. Der Krieg gegen die Buren war ein Krieg gegen Frauen und Kinder. Damals wurde das Konzentrationslager erfunden. In einem englischen Gehirn ist diese Idee geboren worden. Wir haben nur im Lexikon nachgelesen und haben das dann später kopiert. Nur mit einem Unterschied. England hat Frauen und Kinder in diese Lager gesperrt. Und über 20.000 Burenfrauen sind damals jämmerlich zugrunde gegangen. Warum soll also England heute anders kämpfen? Das haben wir vorhergesehen und haben uns darauf vorbereitet.
It was the year 1899, the high noon of British imperialism. Britain was the globe's greatest trader, and its empire encompassed more than a quarter of the human race. The passionate figurehead of the empire was the 80-year-old Queen Victoria. She did not have ministers of defense. She had ministers of war. Indeed, not a single year of her 64-year reign passed without military conflict. At the turn of the century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. On the Boer side, President Paul Kruger, the staunchly conservative father of the Republic, could not be moved to recognize the political aspirations of the fortune seekers, mostly British subjects, who streamed into his country in the rush for gold. They were regarded as Uitlanders, or foreigners. In the opposite corner to Kruger was Cecil John Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, who was determined that the Union Jack would fly over all of Africa. But Rhodes was forced to resign in January 1896 after a blundered coup attempt in the Transvaal by his associate, Dr. Jameson. President Steyn of the Free State saw Jameson's raid as a sign of Britain's intentions to violently overthrow the Boer governments. He joined Kruger's cause by treaty in 1897. Kruger and Steyn's chief antagonist was Sir Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner in South Africa. A man with grand visions of a unified empire producing gold and diamonds for his queen. British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain supported Milner in using the disenfranchisement of British subjects in the Transvaal as a vehicle to push the dispute to the brink of war. President Kruger issued an ultimatum for the withdrawal of British troops, which was predictably rejected. Britain was effectively at war again on the 11th of October 1899. And soldiers arrived from all corners of the empire to serve the Queen, while volunteers from continental Europe, Russia, and the USA supported the Boer cause. The world was at war in Africa. At first, the Boers had the advantage of mobility, speed, and surprise. Britain's initial reverses culminated in what became known as Black Week in mid-December 1899. The second British offensive started in February 1900. The Boer army was forced to withdraw. The steamroller march eventually led to a major Boer defeat when General Piet Cronje surrendered with 4,000 men at Paardeberg. The capture of Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, set the seal on the complete reversal of fortune for the Boer cause. The stage was now set to destroy the two Boer republics and force the Boers to surrender.
And the war escalated, and the guerrilla phase lasted much longer than the initial phases.
Telegraph lines were cut, bridges were blown up, communications were disrupted, ammunition depots were raided.
The British Army tried to transform their slow-moving troops into mounted infantry. Great numbers of reinforcements arrived from the colonies, especially Australia, New Zealand, and Canada.
The scorched earth policy was something that developed over a year during 1900. And the way to punish the Boers who were attacking this line was with a new proclamation on the 16th of June 1900. And Lord Roberts said to his officers to burn down the farm closest to such an attack on the railway line.
And then he began saying any houses within a radius of 1 mile of where the railway was blown up, those houses must be blown up and the people taken prisoners of war. Later, he said within 10 square miles, everything would be blown up.
Now that is a major area. If you take that as a radius, you've got almost 250 square miles that is burned down because of one incident. On the 29th of November 1900,
Lord Roberts handed over command as Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in South Africa to his successor, Lord Kitchener.
Kitchener came with a threefold strategy of total war. First, farm burnings or scorched earth. Secondly, the use of concentration camps for civilians. And third, the blockhouse lines, with barbed wire entanglements right across South Africa.
Approximately 30,000 Boer farms were either totally or partially destroyed. Most of the farms were blown up with dynamite or were burned down. As well as approximately 40 towns, smaller towns and also villages were either totally or partially destroyed by the British, including churches. And the question was now what to do with these people. And the British then decided to establish concentration camps, or as they called them, refugee camps.
They were taken in open cattle trucks, railway trucks, and in many cases they were left at stations for days on end.
First camps are called burger camps. They are then referred to as refugee camps, and then within the British documentation itself they're called concentration camps.
What these camps really were internment camps for detaining women and children who were primarily families of Boers out on commando.
And many of these women were sent to the commandos as emissaries to tell them that the British say that if you don't surrender, your farms will be destroyed, your women and children will suffer.
We are talking of a British army or an imperial army that in total was on to 450,000 men. To support an army like that, you need a labor force. And very many of these black people were taken to labor camps and were used also as laborers to support the British army. In other words, a scorched earth policy had as a result what concentration camps of non-combatants, black refugee camps, black concentration camps and black labor camps.
People were crowded together, large numbers. Brandfort 4,000 people in one camp, Bloemfontein 6,000 people. Whenever an epidemic struck a camp, it spread like wildfire through the camp. If you were under the age of 2 years, and I will actually say under the age of 5 years, if you were placed in a camp, it was the same as if your death warranted inside.
It was planned. Nobody can say they didn't know, especially the commanders.
How could they not know?
41 camps right over the country. There was a central command that got all the statistics and saw this happening. This is a nation dying.
The mother sat on her little trunk with the child across her knee. She had nothing to give it, and the child was sinking fast. We watched the child draw its last breath in reverent silence. The mother neither moved nor wept. Dry-eyed but deathly white, she sat there, in the depths of grief beyond all tears.
The number of women and children and old people who died in the concentration camps, percentage-wise, was a Holocaust.
Soon after the Peace of Vereeniging, the Boer generals, notably the war hero de Wet, visited the camps to explain the negotiated peace. Some women could not accept the principle, protesting that they were resigned to carry on till the bitter end and pay the ultimate price for their freedom. But gradually the burghers arrived from commando to reclaim their families. The complex logistical exercise to ship Boer prisoners of war back from faraway locations like St. Helena, Bermuda and India meant that most of the camps were in operation for months after the war. Many moving tales are told of emotional reunions and tearful visits to the cluttered camp cemeteries as fathers paid their last respects to the children they would never see again.
As far back as 1919, a small political group had begun meeting in Munich. They met to discuss the chaos that had resulted in Germany from the First World War. Attending the earlier meetings was an Army veteran and winner of his country's highest award, the Iron Cross. His name was Adolf Hitler. With great speaking eloquence, Hitler whipped this group into shape, which became known as the German Workers' Party. Hitler designed the swastika, which stood for the cross the Jews killed Christ on. The cross by which we may gain immortality, as represented by the hooks making an ever-turning wheel of everlasting life, turning to the right when looked at, where it will be noted, Jesus says, he will place his sheep.
Can I summarize it now, and I'll do so very as tersely as I can. First, fascism, the original 20th century totalitarian movement, is really, historically, another name for the political activity of the Catholic right wing. There is no other name for it. Francoism, Salazarism, what happened in Croatia, in Austria, in Bavaria, and so on. The Church keeps on trying to apologize for it, can't apologize for it enough. It's the Catholic right. Hitler never repudiated his membership of the Church. And prayers were said for him on his birthday every year till the very end on the orders of the Vatican. And all of these facts are well known, and the Church still hasn't found another way to apologize for that enough. And whatever it is you can call that, you can't call it secular. You may not call it secular. 50%, according to Paul Johnson, the Catholic historian, of the Waffen-SS were confessing Catholics. None of them was ever threatened with excommunication. But Joseph Goebbels was excommunicated for marrying a Protestant. You see, we do have our standards.
For you to say of Nazism that it was the implementation of the work of Charles Darwin is a filthy slander, undeserving of you, and an insult to this audience. Darwin's thought was not taught in Germany. Darwinism was derided in Germany, along with every other form of unbelief. All the great modern atheist thinkers, Darwin, Einstein, and Freud, were alike despised. If it's an atheistic regime, then how come that in the first chapter of Mein Kampf, Hitler says he's doing God's work and executing God's will? How come the Führer oath that every officer of the party and the army had to take begins, I swear in the name of Almighty God, my loyalty to the Führer? How come that on the belt buckle of every Nazi soldier it says Gott mit uns, God on our side? How come that the first treaty made by the National Socialist dictatorship, the very first, is with the Vatican, exchanging political control of Germany for Catholic control of German education? Again, this is not a difference of emphasis between us to suggest that there's something fascistic about me and my beliefs is something I won't hear said and you shouldn't believe.
The following is an excerpt from Adolf Hitler's speech to the Reichstag on January 30th, 1939, in which he responded to ongoing atrocity propaganda in the international media concerning alleged religious persecution of Christians and of the Christian Church within Germany. He set the record straight with regard to National Socialist Germany's religious policy and its support for the Christian Church. He then rebuked the Western democratic leaders for their utter hypocrisy. The National Socialist state has not closed even one single church, neither prevented church services nor infringed on the conduct of Mass. In the National Socialist state, everyone is free to find salvation in whichever way they choose. However, the National Socialist state will relentlessly deal with those priests who, instead of serving the Lord, see their mission in propagating derisive comments on our present Reich, its institutions, or its leading men. The motivation behind certain statesmen in the democracies abroad taking such a vigorous interest in a few German priests is obviously political. For these very same democratic statesmen remained silent when in Russia hundreds of thousands of priests were hacked to pieces and their bodies burned. These democratic statesmen remained equally silent at the brutal slaughter of priests and nuns in Spain, numbering in the tens of thousands, some of whom were even burned alive. These democratic statesmen could not deny these facts, but they remained silent, and nothing broke their silence. In the meantime, upon news of these massacres, countless National Socialists and fascist volunteers placed themselves at General Franco's disposal. They did so to prevent this Bolshevist bloodbath from enveloping all of Europe, and hence the greater part of the civilized world. It was concern for European culture and the essence of civilization which led Germany to take sides in this struggle between nationalist Spain and the Bolshevists, who attempted to destroy it. National Socialists shared in General Franco's uprising because of their burning desire to promote his cause, to avert the danger threatening to engulf his country, a danger Germany itself had almost succumbed to. Therefore, it cannot be sympathy or pity for the persecuted servants of God that has mobilized the interest of the democratic citizens in some priests in Germany who have come into conflict with the law. Rather, these interest them as German enemies of the state.
Intermarium was a political group formed in the 1920s after the Russian Revolution. It was composed of Catholic nationalists committed to holding the line against the communists, a Catholic curtain across Europe.
In the 30s, it was Stalin was a pretty powerful man, and communist propaganda was extremely potent. And Pius XI, who died in 1939, was a vigorous opponent of communism and mobilized Catholic organizations to fight communism. And was he wrong? Of course not.
Intermari means between the seas, and in the 20s and 30s, a federation of Catholic states from the Baltic to the Adriatic was Vatican policy, to fight the threat of Bolshevism.
Communism was a threat to the Church on two levels: on the theoretical, ideological level, namely on theory that God doesn't exist, and then this modern society should be based on godlessness. And then the second, on the practical level of simple persecution. Stalin annihilated the Catholic Church in the Soviet Union, and the Communist Party abroad was obviously following suit. If they could ever get control of the political power, they would follow the same pattern. So on this double level, there was perfectly good reason for the Catholic Church, and above all in the leadership of the Pope, to take a very dim view indeed of the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin.
In the East, the Catholic Church was fighting for its very existence. This life and death struggle drew it into the political intrigues of Intermarium. Before war broke out, some members of the British elite were openly pro-fascist and supported Hitler. They saw the Nazis as the protectors of Europe, defending it against communism, and used their powers and influence to say so. The doyen of this group was the Duke of Windsor. In 1941, the British backed a coup to topple the pro-German government of Yugoslavia. Operation Barbarossa, the assault on Russia, was delayed and the Wehrmacht turned on the Balkans instead. The entire campaign took only 10 days. The flag bearers of Croatian nationalism were invited to form a government. Croatia was independent, and Pavlish's dream of power had become a reality. The 3-week-old government passed anti-Jewish laws that were even stricter than the Nazis. Croatia was one of the Vatican's favoured nations. Monasteries were given over to Pavlish and used as military bases. Archbishop Stepinac served at Ustashi ceremonies blessing volunteers for the SS, where the Ustashi symbol of the gun, dagger and grenade lay on the altar. Franciscan monks took an active part in the military campaign. Shortly after he ascended to power in 1941, Pavlish had a private audience in the Vatican with Pope Pius XII. Darcy Osborne, the British ambassador to the Holy See, was asked by the Foreign Office to convey its dismay. The Vatican was unmoved. In May 1943, Pius XII again received Pavlish in another private audience.
I know the British, the Americans particularly, I talked to And Tittman, the American charge d'affaires that night, was quite perplexed and annoyed, irritated that the Pope received Pavlich. If he comes to the Pope as a Catholic, the Pope can't refuse and he was an important Catholic. So the Vatican's explanation to Tittman was that the Pope did not receive him as head of the Croatian state, but as a Catholic. But on the face of it, it looks, as if a sort of recognition, and obviously Pavlich, of course, played it up, as recognition of Croatia.
The communist victory in Yugoslavia brought an end to the political power of the Catholic Church. The war was over. Pavlich fled with a convoy of loyal Ustashi.
They wanted to go home. Or, on the other hand, some of them says that why should I go home? My country is occupied by the Red Army, by the communists. Well, among the tens and hundreds of thousands of refugees, there were undoubtedly some Nazis, Germans, or from Hungary, for that matter. And naturally, they didn't use their own names. If they had any papers, they destroyed them, and they passed for refugee.
Throughout 1945, Tito's diplomats demanded the arrest and extradition of Pavlich and his Ustashi henchmen. 3 months later, internal communiques in the British Foreign Office admitted,
"It is becoming increasingly clear that many of the more important quislings are taking refuge under the wing of the Church."
Researchers in America, Australia and Yugoslavia have reconstructed the route taken by Pavlich down the rat lines. His story is typical of thousands of others who escaped. In December 1946, intelligence from Austria noted that it was more and more likely that Pavlich was in Italy and that his whereabouts were known to a Dr. Draganovic and no one else. Dr. Draganovic had offered his help to Pavlich in Austria and supplied him with false ID papers.
In April 1946, Pavlich left Austria accompanied by an Ustashi lieutenant. Both were dressed as Roman Catholic priests.
In Milan, Pavlich used the papers supplied by Draganovic to obtain a Spanish passport in the name of Don Pedro Gona. By May 1946, Pavlich had made his way to Rome. Finally, it became obvious that he had found sanctuary inside Vatican property.
Stalin annihilated the Catholic Church in the Soviet Union, and the Communist Party abroad was obviously following suit. If they could ever get control of the political power, they would follow the same pattern.